The United States' decision to veto a UN Security Council resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza has been sharply criticized by China. Beijing says the move sends the wrong message that gives a green light for continued killings. But the White House says the resolution proposed by Algeria would jeopardize ongoing talks to end the war. We have a report.
Algeria's top UN diplomat Ama Benjama, who proposed the ceasefire deal, says the UN Security Council has failed once again. In his frustration, he said, posterity will judge. France's ambassador to the UN, Nicolas de Rivere, expressed regret that the resolution had not been adopted, especially with the disastrous situation in Gaza. Washington's ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, says it is not the right time to call for an immediate ceasefire because negotiations between Hamas and Israel is continuing.
On the table right now would, in fact, negatively impact those negotiations. Demanding an immediate, unconditional ceasefire without an agreement requiring Hamas to release the hostages will not bring about a durable peace. Instead, it could extend the fighting between Hamas and Israel.
The UK representative Barbara Woodward says the plan could make a ceasefire deal less likely by endangering talks. But the US has proposed its own temporary ceasefire resolution, which also warned Israel not to invade the city of Rafah. The U.S. decision to block Algeria's resolution as fighting continues in Gaza was backed by 13 of the 15 members of the UN Security Council, with the UK abstaining. In response to the veto, China's UN ambassador Zhang Jun said the claim that the motion would interfere with the ongoing diplomatic negotiations was totally untenable. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is adamant on carrying out ground attacks in Gaza. He says for Israel to gain complete victory, Hamas must be wiped out and all Israeli hostages freed by the 10th of March. Hamas, on its part, is calling for an end to hostilities and the release of Palestinian hostages by Israel. Egyptian and Qatari mediators are lobbying for a lasting ceasefire agreement between the warring sides. Meanwhile, in Rafah, northern Gaza, life is getting tougher by the day, with latest reports saying Israeli soldiers struck trucks with relief materials to civilians caught up in the war.
And for more on the situation in Gaza, the ongoing invasion of Rafah, and the diplomatic row, global affairs analyst Collins Uweke joins me now for in-depth analysis. Good to have you join us.
Thank you, Precious, for having me.
Now, this is the fourth time the U.S. has vetoed the idea of a ceasefire in the UN Security Council. But what do you make of the reason given by the U.S. this time that it is not the right time to call for an immediate ceasefire while negotiations between Hamas and Israel are ongoing?
The United States is basically on their own in their summation that the timing is wrong. At the center of all of this is a ceasefire. The issue now is, what is the right timing? And when the US says that if an immediate ceasefire is instituted, that it is going to jeopardize ongoing negotiations, you could clearly see from the fact that 13 out of the 15 Security Council members supported Algeria's move, while the US basically was standing alone because even the UK that stood by its side was very weak in its own defense. And even being on their side, they didn't vote against it. I mean, the UK, they simply abstained, which means that they are neither here nor there. Now, when all of this happens, Precious, what it brings to the fore is the inequality among nations that exists within the Security Council. It also sharpens the argument against this obnoxious veto power that, a few countries hold, and the need to actually find something that is a bit more equitable and a bit more just.
And it's interesting that you mentioned earlier that the U.S. is standing on its own, because right after that, we saw the heavy criticism also coming from a series of Israeli and U.S. allies. For example, France's representative expressed regret that the resolution was not adopted, given what they said is a disastrous situation on the ground. The U.S. is going to put forward a temporary ceasefire resolution. How do you expect members of the UN Security Council to react to that resolution?
Well, I think this is one of those times where logic and common sense, needs to take the upper hand. It is difficult to know exactly how they are going to vote, and one can only expect that they vote with their head and not their heart by actually supporting it, because any form of ceasefire, even if it is just like the few that had, taking place in the past, where they say it's for 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, a week, or so on and so forth, that is something much better than this consistent bombardment that we continue to see. Now, the U.S. is basically going to tweak one or two things here and there to make it look as if they have not, they are not supporting a ceasefire, but, a temporary ceasefire, according to them, to allow, more negotiations and sustainable solution is better than, the veto power that they have just wielded in this UN resolution.
But there is also a twist to what we're seeing play out, because it is the first time that the U.S. president will be using the word ceasefire. He has failed to use that word, a couple of times. What does that tell you about the state of relations between Israel and its allies?
First, I will tell you what it tells us about the United States. It tells us that the United States now realize that their position is untenable. Their position, especially under the Democrats, is completely and roundly against what they believe in. But the point remains that Israel is a natural ally of the United States, and it is basically inconceivable for the United States to break ties with, Israel. The closest we saw, to what could be considered as a critical conflict between the United States and Israel was during Obama's regime. And now that Joe Biden has allowed the use of ceasefire, it tells us that, relationships between Netanyahu of Israel and Biden of the United States is actually hitting a very, very bad and dangerous spot, particularly for Israel. So in the coming days, in the coming weeks, it may well be that the United States will be drawing closer and closer to what should be considered as normalcy in terms of speaking out and standing resolutely for a ceasefire.
I wonder if Joe Biden can risk that, especially when you look at the fact that elections are just around the corner and the continued support of Americans for Israel. But I also wanted to get your overall thoughts on the hearings at the ICJ and the implication and ramification overall for the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas.
Well, it is difficult to predict what is going to happen, but of course, for some of us who have watched the proceedings and, hear the sort of, questions and, the angle to which the arguments are being driven, there is cause for hope that finally there is going to be a pronouncement that actually puts Israel on edge. Now, the fact that that is very, very likely to happen does not necessarily mean that Israel is going to respect it, because it would not be the first time that, Israel will be ignoring rulings of international courts or other, human rights, organizations that tells them that what they are doing in, Gaza, in Palestine, as a matter of fact, completely, is, very, very bad. So yes, it looks likely that the ruling will go against Israel's occupation and their continued bombardment, but the extent to which that will impact on the situation as we have it today remains wait and see.
Interesting. Just a lot to follow through on in this ongoing war. Thank you so much for talking to us as always. And I know you're watching and following this development. Global Affairs analyst Colin Suwiki.
Thank you for having me, Precious.
And still on the war between Israel and Hamas, the president of Colombia and Bolivia say they are in support